And thank you all for coming today. So before I get started, I thought I'd give a little more background to my organisation and my role at a fire agency. The agency I work for, which David mentioned, is the Country Fire Authority, or also known as CFA. It's a volunteer-based organisation that manages fires on private land of Victoria. We work closely with other fire agencies in Victoria to prepare and respond to the fires and assist in recovery. With this comes a need for evidence-based decision making. So there is a really important role for research within fire agencies. As manager of R&D, research and development, I lead a group of high-performing technical and scientific professionals to conduct research and develop tools and systems that assist in all parts of bushfire management. Some examples include improving our understanding of fire behaviour through experimental fires to predict how fires spread and behave, determining suppression effectiveness, so how well we detect and put out fires using aircraft and ground-based resources. We also have social scientists exploring ways to better understand how we communicate risk. And then climate change, to understand the implications of climate change on fire, so emergency services know what they'll be facing in the future. We also have operational roles to ensure we have a grounded understanding of the needs of the fire agency. So my role that I'm being trained for is a fire behaviour analyst. So this allows me to work at state control centre or incident control centres during the fire season, where I provide advice to decision makers on fire potential for that day and the days to come. And for a going fire, what we provide advice on fire spread and behaviour. So today I will start by giving a brief background of fires in Australia and then give an overview of observed and projected climate change for Australia. I'll then take a closer look at climate change in relation to key drivers of vegetation fires. I'll then talk about some of the implications of climate change and fire for bushfire management, and then follow that with some of the adaptation required or opportunities that exist. This includes what fire agencies are doing to better understand the implications for bushfire management. To ensure everyone knows where I am and the focus for this presentation, I thought I would share a map of Australia and of course a picture of a kangaroo. So this is Australia. It's made up of 7 states and territories, and the focus area for my presentation today will be the southeast region. This is where many of the high impacting fires in Australia occur. It's also where I live and the focus of much of my research that I'll present today. I'll especially focus on the state of Victoria, the area in the red circle. Also note, I'm using the word wildfire and bushfire interchangeably. In Australia, we commonly use the term bushfire to mean all vegetation fires. But you also note we sometimes separate out grass fires to just cover grass and bushfires to cover forest fires. Yes, I know it can be confusing and I apologise in advance. So a little bit of context about fires in Australia. There is evidence to suggest the first people of Australia regularly used fire for a variety of reasons over 50,000 years ago, and some traditional owners still use fire where opportunities exist. The reasons include hunting, spiritual reasons, communication, and to look after the country, to keep it healthy. When European settlers arrived, they broadly had little experience with fire, and there was more of a focus on extinguishing fires and fire suppression. From my perspective, contemporary fire management tries to sit somewhere in between. Fuel management is an important part of our role, but so too is suppression, and there are many social and political expectations placed on fire agencies. So when and why do we have bushfires in Australia? The Australian climate is generally hot, dry and prone to drought. At any time of year, some part of Australia is prone to bushfires. The widely varied fire seasons are reflected in the continent's different weather patterns. For most of southern Australia, the danger period is in summer and autumn. The central eastern areas, such as New South Wales and southern Queensland, the peak risk usually occurs in spring and early summer, and then northern Australia experiences most of its fires in winter and spring. Grassland fires frequently occur after good periods of rain, which result in abundant growth that dries out in hot weather. Bushfires tend to occur when light and heavy fuel loads in eucalypt forests have dried out, usually following periods of low rain. The potential for extreme fire varies greatly throughout Australia, both in frequency and severity. When potential extreme fire weather is experienced close to populated areas, significant loss is possible. So in terms of total area burnt, the largest fires are in Northern Australia. However, most of the loss of life, economic damage occurs around the fringe of the cities where homes are commonly in close proximity to flammable vegetation. That's generally in the south. Some examples of high impacting bushfires in southeastern Australia over the last 150 years. Extending back to 1851, we had a day called Black Tuesday where there were 12 lives lost and up to 15 million hectares burned. 1939, which is shown in this figure here, burnt 2 million hectares and there were 71 lives lost. Ash Wednesday, more recently in 1983, 47 lives lost. And Black Saturday, one of our deadliest fires on record, claiming 170 lives lost. It was in 2009. And then more recently, what is called Black Summer, which occurred last summer, so our 2019-2020 season. Some of the impacts include 34 direct deaths, but indirect health impacts attributed to smoke exposure, with estimates of over 400 deaths and thousands of hospitalisations. Over 18 million hectares were burned. It destroyed nearly 6,000 buildings, many of these homes, impacted hundreds of threatened flora and fauna species, and it's expected to be Australia's costliest disaster. And a recent attribution study found that the fire season was made 30% more likely due to climate change. So focusing on climate change in Australia. Australia's climate has warmed since national records began in 1910, with most warming occurring since 1950. Australia's mean surface temperature has increased by more than 1.4 degrees since 1910. And since 1950, every decade has been warmer than its predecessor. Australia's warmest year on record was 2019, and the 7 years from 2013 to 2019 all rank in the 9 warmest years. This long-term warming trend means that most years are now warmer than any other observed during the 20th century. Australia's rainfall is highly variable and is strongly influenced by drivers such as El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, the Indian Ocean Dipole and the Southern Annular Mode. Despite this natural variability, long trends are evident in Australia's rainfall record. There's been a shift towards drier conditions across the southwest and the southeast, with more frequent years of below average rainfall, especially for the cool season months of April to October, noting that these are our key periods for fire seasons and drying out of fuels. We're also experiencing more frequent extreme heat days. This plot bottom left is the number of days each year where the Australian area average daily mean temperature for each month is extreme. As you can see, there is a clear upward trend. As for projections, the key climate research organisations, CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology, have found an increase in average temperature of 1 to 4.5 degrees can be expected by the end of the century. An increase in the number of hot days, a decrease in winter and spring rainfall for southern Australia, more time spent in drought and hotter droughts, decrease in winter rain for southern Australia. Additionally, and also relevant to fire, is more sunshine is projected in winter and spring with lower relative humidity and higher evaporation rates throughout the year. And soil moisture is also projected to decrease. This is a loop for temperature for a few days in the future, showing one model output for one of the scenarios, which indicates by the end of the century, temperature reaching above 50 in Victoria and all the way down to Melbourne, where I live. That's not something I'm looking forward to. Okay, so that is the current situation with observed and current and projected climate change for Australia. Now taking a closer look at what this might mean for fire. To do this, I'll use the conceptual model that describes fire activity in terms of 4 factors, often referred to as switches, that must be fulfilled or switched on for fires to occur. There must be weather conditions conducive to spread, fuel available, including sufficient and continuous biomass, fuel dry enough to burn, and an ignition source. And noting that the focus of this work will mostly be on southeastern Australia. So starting with fire weather, and in some ways I'm starting with the easiest driver. It's more directly linked to climate change and there is a lot of research on this topic, and it's also the area I've focused on. So to predict and measure fire weather, we use fire weather indices. These are made up of surface conditions that are known to affect fire in South and Southeastern Australia, and we mostly use MacArthur's Forest Fire Danger Index, or FFDI. So this is a combination of drought indices and weather parameters, and it's based on the level of which firefighters can successfully suppress a fire, and it's used broadly for issuing fire danger ratings. While fire weather indices are not always representative of fire activity or dangerous fire conditions, for example, they don't capture upper atmospheric dynamics, they're still really useful, especially in Victoria. So this figure shows the year-to-year variability in extreme FFDI and burnt area for Victoria across the season. As you can see, they are significantly related. This is important because as I move on to climate change, I'll focus on observations and projections of this index, FFDI. So for Australia, there's been a number of studies that have analysed how FFDI has changed over the last 50 years or so. Recently, using a high quality automatic weather station dataset, so observations, not modelled, we show that there's been an increase in FFDI across Australia, with the greatest change occurring in spring and summer, particularly in southeast of Australia. For Victoria, we've seen an increase in the number of days with an FFDI over 25. This is a rating of very high fire danger. During the fire season for the period 1972 through to about 2002, there was an average of 66 days per fire season with an FFDI over 25. Since 2003 through to the end of the fire, to the end of the study period, that's increased to 94 days per year. There are only 6 fire seasons that have had over 100 days with this FFDI over 25, and they've all occurred in the last 2 decades. There's also been an increase in the frequency of high impacting events as measured by FFDI. In this figure from a study, you can see that we have a 15-year gap between high impacting events, then a 21-year gap. But since then, we appear to have much shorter gaps, including a 4-year gap, 2-year gap, 4-year gap, and so on, highlighting the increasing frequency of more extreme fire weather. Taking a look at whether the fire season is lengthening for specific regions, we look at how often an FFDI greater than 25, averaged across Victoria, occurred before the 1st of September, 1972 through to 2017. We found that before 2002, this happened 5 times in a 30-year period. But from 2002 onwards, so a 15-year period, the occurrence of FFDI greater than 25 has occurred 10 times. We also conducted this analysis for the end of the fire season and did not find a significant change. So another piece of work by the Bureau of Meteorology have also been exploring lengthening fire seasons by state and bioregions. They identified the first day of the year from July with the FFDI over 25 for a almost 70-year period and found the fire season is clearly expanding, with it now typically starting 1 to 3 months earlier and ending 2 to 6 weeks later, depending on the region. Moving into what is being projected for fire weather. The left panel on the right of the screen reveals the projected changes in FFDI, with firstly the number of days over 25 and then with the 95th percentile for a period 2060 to 2079. The results indicate that we will have an increase in days over 25 and more extreme days. Additionally, this same study by Andrew Dowdy, a researcher at the Bureau of Meteorology, looked at pyroconvection risk factors. Many of you would have noticed the increasing attention of the development of pyro-CB events in both hemispheres. There has been an upward trend in the number of events globally, but the record is short. This study found that the conditions that are favourable for pyroconvection development, based on the C. Haynes index, due to atmospheric stability and humidity changes, there is a projected increase in the risk of pyroconvection occurrence. Specifically for Victoria, new research that focuses on how climate change will influence fire weather in Victoria indicates a 10 to 20% increase in FFDI under the worst case scenario. This is expected by the end of the century, with the greatest change occurring in the northwestern parts of Victoria. Thus, in the west and northwest, the highest average FFDI day is likely to increase from about 75 to near 100. In the southeast, the average being mid to high 30s will change to 50. Focusing on how the number of days with an FFDI over 25, so that very high fire danger rating, will change. We find the largest increase in the number of such days is in the northwest of the state, with the model average increasing from approximately 60 days per year in the historic period to around 100 days by the end of the century. However, other locations are projected to have larger relative increases in very high fire danger days, with central areas likely to have a doubling in the number of days, and in the east of the state, we may even experience a tripling in the number of days. So moving on to the next driver, fuel dryness. So there's many factors to consider. In Australia, high solar radiation and low relative humidity, combined with the effects of multi-year droughts, allow forest environments to move into highly flammable states. For example, rainfall deficits influence fuel dryness over weeks to annual time scales, leading to increased fuel availability, meaning the fraction of fine dead fuels dry enough to burn. Living vegetation also dries in response to declining soil moisture. The figure in the top right highlights the importance of spring conditions in Victoria for drying the fuels and therefore determining the type of severity of fire season we are likely to experience. This plot includes spring rainfall on the y-axis and max temp on the x-axis for a 110-year period. It also put boxes around some of the significant fire seasons we have experienced. As you can see, most of these occur when we have hot and dry spring conditions. It's important to note that this varies depending on vegetation type. We find that high levels of rainfall in spring can lead to greater grass growth, and this results in a high number of grass fires in subsequent fire seasons. Drought is also an important factor in fuel dryness. Drought promotes leaf shedding in eucalypt forests, generating a significant amount of fuel on the ground. If the drought is severe enough, it can cause canopy die-off or tree mortality. Essentially, during drought, areas that rarely experience fires become more common. Some examples of drought preceding significant fire events in Southeast Australia include the drought before Ash Wednesday 1983, the Millennium Drought before Black Saturday in 2009, and the drought that especially affected New South Wales preceding Black Summer, as shown by that rainfall deficit map. We know temperature is going up, and as shown in the figure below, rainfall has decreased in Southeast Australia during the months that are important for drying fuels. Other indices, such as those that measure soil moisture, also indicate observed drying. The Keach Biome Drought Index is an indicator of soil moisture deficit and shows an increasing trend over the last decade. This is shown in the middle panel here. Furthermore, short-term influences on dead fuel moisture, as indicated by the vapour pressure deficit, also displays an increasing trend in recent decades. This is shown in the bottom panel on the right. A recent study suggests that warming-driven fuel drying provides the strongest connection of human-caused climate change to the observed increase in wildfires that have been experienced in California. We also have anecdotal evidence of vegetation fires that rarely burn being flammable enough to now burn. For example, we had the subtropical rainforests in and around the heritage-listed Lamington National Park in Queensland that burned in October 2019, and the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area in Tasmania's southwest. These areas contain some fire-sensitive species and are usually too moist to be flammable, but both areas had significant drying in the preceding months and years, ensuring they were flammable enough to carry fire when extreme fire weather conditions occurred. So what is being projected in terms of fuel dryness into the future? A study that examined the sensitivity of fuel moisture to changes in temperature and precipitation and explored implications on future climate found that for every degree of warming, precipitation needs to increase by 15% for forest fuel moisture content to compensate for the drying caused by warmer temperatures. For Victoria, we're unlikely to receive the projected rainfall to compensate for the projected increased temperature. Looking at the figure on the right, you can see changes in fire weather parameters projected for 2085 to 2100 under one of the scenarios across the months of the year. For Victoria, the projections indicate increases in temp across all months, reduced precipitation and RH at the surface during spring, but it also reveals how drought factor is likely to increase across winter and spring and into summer, again supporting the case for drier conditions in the future. Finally, in terms of drought, we learned earlier that according to the CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology, climate change projections suggest the time in drought is projected to increase in southern Australia with a greater frequency of drought. Now moving on to climate change and biomass. When I'm talking about biomass, I mean the presence of biomass, and this includes fuel element, structure, amount, and continuity. Out of all the drivers I'm discussing today, this one contains the greatest uncertainty. There are far more questions than answers, such as how will vegetation respond to higher temperatures and reduced cool season rain? How will vegetation respond to increased atmospheric CO2? How will vegetation respond to potentially higher fire frequency? What will be the influence of bushfire management on biomass through prescribed burning and suppression? Will there be shifts in vegetation communities in response to changing climate or more frequent and severe fires? How will the fire regime be altered due to change in biomass? When exploring the influence of climate on vegetation, we find that enhanced atmospheric CO2 has the potential to increase plant photosynthesis and consequently fuel loads. In fact, a study by Clark and others in 2016 predicted fuel load using net primary productivity simulated using a land surface model found about a 1.5 tonne per hectare increase in mean annual litter in temperate forested areas and about a 0.4 tonne per hectare increase in grassland areas. But there's other factors such as climate, water availability and nutrients all determine plant growth. So overall, there is no clear evidence yet of whether fuel load in Southeast Australia's vegetated areas will change markedly as a result of rising atmospheric CO2 levels, rising temperatures and decreasing precipitation. When exploring the influence of fire on biomass, the extensive wildfires in Victoria in recent years have provided the opportunity to examine the effects of multiple wildfires on tree mortality and regeneration in temperate eucalypt forests. A review study found that historical and recent evidence indicates that recurrent wildfires threaten the persistence of fire-sensitive obligate cedar eucalypt forests, which can facilitate a shift to non-forest states if successive fires occur within the tree's primary juvenile period. Also, there is potential for structural and state changes in the fire-tolerant resprouter forests, particularly if recurrent severe wildfires kill seedlings and increase tree mortality. Since this study, there's been an area that has been burned a third time, so we'll be watching this vegetation response closely. So in summary, the biological responses to increased temperature, CO2, extreme events and changes to rainfall patterns, as well as shifts in species distribution and interactions represent one of the greatest challenges to predicting future fire regimes. Until the processes are better understood and then represented in Earth system models and projections of climate change, this will continue to be an area of uncertainty. However, there is plenty of research currently underway. And I just want to point out that this reference to Harris et al. 2016 is not me. It is another researcher in Australia that focuses on vegetation and fire, and I can't claim her research. Finally, moving on to the last key driver that I'll discuss today, and that is ignitions. The main sources of ignitions are through humans being accidental and deliberate and natural sources such as lightning. The reasons behind human-caused ignitions are complex and any link with climate change are indirect. So today I'll focus on ignitions just from lightning. So under warmer conditions, it is likely that the potential for lightning-ignited wildfires will increase in response to climate change. This is due to the combination of more ignitable fuels, but also warmer temperatures, encouraging more thunderstorms, which in turn brings more lightning and greater fire risk. A study has found that for every degree of warming, we can expect a 12% increase in lightning occurrence. This is supported by a study focusing on fire records in the Southern Hemisphere that climate change may result in more ignitions, as they found a link between increased lightning ignited fire occurrence and climate change, and this trend is likely to continue. Analysis of long-term changes in the occurrence frequency of dry lightning conditions indicates an increase for some regions of Southeast Australia, as well as a decrease for some regions of Northern and Central Australia during winter and spring. The seasons of interest for Southeastern Australia are spring and summer, when the fuels are usually available to burn, and that is when we're seeing this number of dry lightning events increasing, as shown by these red circles. So a summary of changes in key fire drivers as a function of climate change for Southeastern Australia, and putting my levels of confidence in the stated knowledge. For fire weather, we're likely to see an increase, and we've got pretty high confidence to support that. For fuel dryness, we're likely to see an increase in many of the forested types with medium confidence. Biomass amount is largely unknown. I'd say there's a lot of uncertainty and not much confidence. And for ignitions from lightning, we're likely to see an increase, but there's low confidence. There's not a lot of research to support that yet. So what does this mean for fire regimes and also fire management? Potential implications for fire regimes. With hotter and drier conditions, we're likely to lead to more flammable fuels. With the greatest change being projected in spring, so these hotter and drier conditions extending into spring, it's leading to experiencing a longer fire season. An increasing pyroconvection risk and lightning ignited fires. We might see more fires and more extreme bushfire conditions. The shorter intervals between high severity fires. This may threaten some vegetation species persistence, resulting in a feedback on the fire regime. So the implications for fire management. Longer and more extreme fire conditions could result in more firefighter fatigue and hot days and heat waves, even leading to heat stroke. The increased demand for resources, being both personnel but also equipment, aircrafts, etc. That reduced capacity to share resources nationally and internationally. I didn't talk about the fire seasons and the fire seasons in other countries, but there is overlapping now. Reduced or shifting opportunities for fuel reduction burns in some regions, and more expensive overall. The tangible costs for Black Summer, that 2019-2020 season in Australia, are estimated to be 100 billion. So what can we do as fire agencies? And what are some of the things that we are already doing? So we could explore increasing the application of fuel reduction burning to reduce fire risk. Ensure we share prescribed burning knowledge, especially by engaging traditional owners. We could invest in research within fire agencies and partner with national and international scientific experts. Ensure we are innovative and adopt new technology when available and fit for purpose, and become smarter in the way we fight fires, more effective. We could increase capacity and capability of firefighters and share resources where possible. Reduce the exposure of assets through land use planning regulation, building codes and resilient building design. And finally, build community resilience through early warning systems, community engagement, including shared responsibility, emergency evacuation planning and house and property maintenance. These are a few of the adaptation opportunities that we should explore or already are. This brings me to the opportunity to highlight research and development that fire agencies are doing to be proactive in preparing for operating in a climate challenge world. Many of the figures that I focused on when I was showing fire weather in Victoria in today's presentation were from this work. Over the last decade, Victorian's fire agencies have been supporting and funding the development of fire weather datasets that can be used directly to address fire management specific questions. The first dataset was a historical fire weather dataset. This includes hourly data from 1972 through to 2020 on a 4-kilometre grid for each climate variable, along with fire and drought indices. This has been used for a number of purposes in research, but also operationally, to simulate past fires to understand fire behaviour and spread, to develop scenarios for planning and determine areas of greatest risk and where prescribed burning will be most effective, and for understanding the trends and variability in fire weather over the last 45 odd years, including how prescribed burn windows are changing. The next dataset developed is a projected fire weather dataset. This includes daily climate and fire and drought data from 12 models, 3 scenarios, and goes through to 2100. This is currently being used to understand how fire weather will change in the future so fire managers can prepare and adapt. It gives us the opportunity to address questions such as how many more extreme weather days will we have, and when and where will these occur? This is useful for determining future resource needs. Finally, as covered in this talk, it is difficult to determine how the fire regime will change without determining how the fuel will respond. So the next steps for us will be to develop a vegetation change dataset through modelling climate, vegetation and fire interactions. And we plan to use this to determine changes in fire regimes, such as intensity, frequency, seasonality, and then also from that determine implications for bushfire and land managers. So this fire agency-led work is essential for ensuring questions of relevance to fire and land managers are at a scale and in a format that is accessible and can be used to inform real fire management problems. So in conclusion, some key messages. Victoria is already experiencing longer fire seasons and an increase in dangerous fire weather, and this is projected to worsen. There are still uncertainties around the other drivers of vegetation fires, ignition, fuel dryness and biomass, but with a lot of research underway, I'm sure we'll start to reduce these uncertainties. And finally, there are opportunities to adapt, build community resilience, conduct more fuel hazard reduction burning, and invest in research and technology. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for your very nice and kind presentation. We have so far a couple of questions that I can read from you, but let me say the relevance of your presentation and the work that you're undertaking in Australia. For me, it's very important the fact that the climate change has not to be understood as a whole, but there are multiple factors that the climate change thing that can be broken down into multiple factors. You have mentioned many of them: the prolonged drought periods, the change in the precipitation regimes. You have also mentioned the increase of wildfire starting due to lightnings. So there are many factors here involved as a result of the climate change, and it's very relevant the study of how they are interrelated among each other. And I think that given the climate context in which we are involved, grounding all this knowledge on science is very important and very relevant to be able to face up these challenges posed by the climate change. I guess that the challenge is to transfer all this scientific evidence and knowledge into management practices, into best practices, in order to mitigate the effects of the future fires. Well, we have several questions. I'm going to start for the first one. The first one says it's about the fire weather index, and says in order to better communicate with communities, what they should do on which level. Do you consider a good idea to reduce it for only 3 levels?
Yes, good question. And so for people who, so I don't know if that person is from Australia, but I will flick back to our fire danger rating. So this is what we currently have in Victoria. So we've got several different ratings. And there has been a bit of conversation, there has been a lot of conversation lately about the need for so many different ratings, so many different categories. What I think is important for this is what the action is behind each of those ratings or categories. So I guess what we'd need to work out, rather than choosing 3 or 4 or however many we have, is what we want the communities to do, or what will make the communities respond to the different category. So I think it makes sense to have less categories if that means that we will get clearly defined actions to each of these categories. So not a clear yes or no answer, but yeah, I agree that we need to first work out what the actions are to the different fire danger categories, and then we should work out how many categories we need.
Okay, thank you. By the way, it's very curious that the lowest category is already low and moderate, and then the second one is already high. We have a question from Judith Kirchner, which says, it's a quick question. There is some very interesting work on colonial fire history on Cyprus by Sarah Harris. This was not done by you, was it?
No.
She said that she Googled this before and she's not sure if you are the author of this work.
No, so that's interesting. There's another Sarah Harris, and because I did point out there was a Rebecca Harris that was authoring articles about vegetation and fire, so I can't claim all of these papers, but it sounds good, and it's good to know there's another Sarah Harris out there doing work on fires.
That was clear enough, Sarah. A question coming from Martin Hoffman. Hi, Sarah. Could you elaborate a bit more on the reduced opportunity for fuel reduction burns? Is that linked to extended fire season?
Yeah, so we have looked a little bit into how we often call them planned burn windows or prescribed burns or fuel reduction windows. And yes, so the change in these windows is due to that lengthening fire season, but we're not really saying there's a reduced opportunity yet. I don't think we've got the evidence to support that there's a reduced opportunity in the windows. They're probably more likely shifted at this stage. So, but that is an area that we're looking into closely. If we just used thresholds by fire agencies that are set, they're quite broad, and you can't see any evidence for these changing windows, but we are looking into what those flammability thresholds are for planned burning, prescribed burning, and whether they are changing and whether they will in the future. But at this stage, I'd say they're shifting, and a little bit, yes, is to do with that extending fire season. Noting that the biggest change we're seeing in the fire season is into the spring period, but we do most of our prescribed burns in the autumn period. So that's why we're not seeing this huge change in our prescribed burn windows.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I see that there are quite a few questions. Let me tell you that in case that we do not have time to respond all of them, we will save the questions and Sarah will answer for them after this webinar, and we will then forward the questions to all the audience. Another question coming from Ewa Ermanovitz. Hi, Sarah, nice work. Since you mentioned that there is a potential for community resilience, I wonder what are the key good practices that you observe in this regard? Do you have any tips for improving the communication of risk with communities?
Yeah, so certainly not my area of expertise, but I can talk about one program that is quite successful at CFA, and that's a community-based bushfire management program. And that's where, with the fire agencies reaching out to the communities and the communities leading the bushfire management planning. And so that's where I think we've seen the most success. And then I think, so that's a really good program, and that's putting them in charge, and the community are in charge of the bushfire management plans. And so that's been a really positive program in Victoria. Tips for improving communication of risk. I think we're still working on how we communicate risk, and it's still a growing area of research. And also what we need to really get better at, and this is especially in my area as well, is that communicating the uncertainty, because we can often communicate the risk, but how we go and communicate that uncertainty around that, say that fire weather warning or something like that. We need to really be able to explain the uncertainty around that risk that we've communicated. So yeah, I hope that covers it.
Okay, thank you. So next questions come from Lazaros Philippidis. He says, it seems that worsening climate conditions that will lead to worsening fire conditions is an inevitability. It's not, cannot be, it's unavoidable. Last year, we even saw extended wildfires in Siberia. Are the suggested adaptations sufficient, or will they simply delay for a short time the inevitable and even greater increase in wildfires? So is the only mitigation option to try and protect life and property as much as possible? It's quite a long question.
It is. I mean, I think climate change projections would say that I would have to look at where we are sitting with our different scenarios going forward. As we mentioned, there's different scenarios for how climate change might progress. So I'm not sure on some of these tipping points whether we've reached those. So I guess I would say that yes, protecting life and property is important, but we still do have some options. And that's why I was sort of listing through those adaptation options of I guess, becoming, I guess, better at fighting fires, smarter at fighting fires, doing the research, community resilience. So we still have some options, and there's still a lot of uncertainty around vegetation response and what that means for fire regimes in the future.
Yeah, I think that question was quite relevant because the situation posed by the last year Australian fires, also apart from representing a risk in terms of human life, it was also a risk in terms of loss of biodiversity due to the larger scale of the fires. So the question is, it's clear that the priority is to protect human life, but what about the other elements that needs to be protected as well? No,
yes, and I think fire agencies are concerned about the environmental values and cultural values and a lot of other values as well. And so there's still certainly a priority, and there's certainly hope.
Okay, so next question comes from Carolina. She says, dear Sarah, you mentioned that you are currently working with 12 different models and 3 scenarios to understand how far weather will change in the future. Have you already run those projections? How those models differ in the projections of the FFDI?
Yes, so we have this paper's under review, and the question is, yes, so we have run these models and how they differ for FFDI. We can see that somewhat in this figure that I've put back up here. So this is RCP 8.5, so more of your extreme change in I guess we release a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. And so FFDI is this one over here. So you can see that variability. This is just one scenario, but you can see the variability between all the models. So these are all the models here. So you can see a large variability in the range. All looking at all of them, but all looking at a change in FFDI across all the months, except potentially in autumn. And this is where we're back here. I think I was showing sort of that multi-model mean for these. So that's RCP 4.5, 2 different periods, and RCP 8.5 for 2 different periods. But that's the multi-model mean. So the best way of seeing the difference, oh, actually, I can also show you it in this. So here we've got what the FFDI number of days over 25 for each of those models, running back from the observation period, so 1972, all the way through to 2100. So as you can see, lots of variability between the models. No models necessarily better than the other. No scenario is more realistic than the other. So we have to take all of these as equally valid.
Okay, thank you. The next questions come from Madhuar Plana. He gives the congrats for the amazing presentation. And he says, I'm wondering that if drivers increasing hazard are so cleared and the trends are confirmed, what about putting more attention to exposure and vulnerability? Reduction of citizens, infrastructure, forest functions, in some way assuming that be prepared to let the landscape burn. And he asked if this is in the arena of the social policy academia debate.
I think so. Good question. I think all options are considered. I think definitely in the academic debate, I think would have it. And yeah, I guess, and socially, I think it's coming out. I think it did come out in the media, a lot of these comments. I'm not sure about the political. So I don't think anything's off the table, and I think fire agencies are thinking through all the implications and all the options. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, again, it's complicated because of the multifaceted type of impacts that we have resulting from these fires. Of course, the priority has to be to protect human life and therefore to focus on the exposure and vulnerability, but still, you know, there are like many values to take into account, and of course they are being covered by the scientific community, but it's always something tricky to deal with because the situation is overwhelming and we need to anticipate to all this new era of fires. We got a question related to the operational side coming from Augustinos Hatyanis. He says, very interesting presentation, thank you. Are Australian firefighters, do they receive any wildfire or firefighting training to face up the new situations?
I have to answer, I don't know. If we're talking about specialised, so it being specialised or different, I don't know. I think I can speak from examples that we have provided, as in from the research and development and predictive services, in that we've provided more information about pyro CB and I guess the extreme conditions that can develop. So I think we're doing things like that to try and make sure firefighters are able to identify those features that might occur when they're outside and they start to see these clouds develop and what that might mean. So I think we're trying to make sure we're keeping them across anything that we've learnt, but I'm not sure on the tactical level whether there's any different to sort of firefighting training. But in terms of fire weather, I would say yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. I think that this is very relevant, that all this knowledge can be somehow also converted into enhanced operational practices, practices that lead to more effective and safe operation by the people who work on the ground. We have another question coming from Phil Harwood, and he answers, is there any research on a relationship between climate change and rate of fire spread? He's got another 3 questions. Let's first of all answer this one.
So not that I have worked on. There is research that has looked at more at climate change and more extreme fire weather or more extreme fire conditions. And a lot of that around porous EB and how that's changing. So I guess more not on rates of spread as much, but more on extreme fire behaviour that might come out of it. But not, you know, I can't think of anything specific on rate of spread.
Then his second question is, what do we know about longer, more active fire seasons and firefighter health and well-being?
So probably not really my area, but I can see, I mean, from personal experience, a really long fire season it is certainly going to have implications for firefighter health and well-being. And also that longer longer fire season fighting fires, but then some of these people are then going into prescribed burning, and so there's really no off time. So that's certainly of concern.
Okay, thank you. And then his last question is, what do we know about longer and more intense fire season and volunteer firefighter availability?
Yeah, again, I probably don't know enough about volunteer firefighter availability. I haven't actually researched this specifically, but it's certainly an area of interest, and it'll be certainly something that I plan to look into with now having these projected fire weather data sets. We can now start to look at what that means for bushfire management, and being a volunteer agency, it's certainly a priority for me. So we'll be looking into that. So watch this space.
Okay, we have one last question, so let's go for it. This comes from John from Adelaide Hills. He says, "Hi Sarah, there is a lot of interest in indigenous fire management practices after the Black Summer bushfires, with effectiveness of current fuel management practices is under question. However, indigenous fire management is based on tradition and conditions reaching back many thousands of years. Taking into account your 4 main points of areas that are changing, biomass, etc., is it likely that the adoption of indigenous fire management practices will likely fail as the goalposts have changed so much?"
No, I think there's definitely a place for traditional fire management in all areas, and there's so many positives to implementing traditional burning. It's done broadly across Northern Australia, but we're trying to introduce more and more of it in Southern Australia. And I think there's definitely a place for it. I think their connection with country and reading, I guess, the environment, they know when to implement these burns and when it's best. So I think there's still definitely a place for traditional land management, and hopefully we can do more of it and potentially learn.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So this was the last question.